friends, we enter the second part of the discussion, and the indication is that in that part, neo-romanticism will be discussed in the context of the poet that she has chosen, Professor Payal Nagpal has chosen. And this interest in romanticism in the 20th and 21st centuries is really surprising, because romanticism was actually discarded at the end of the 19th century itself, and people became either intellectual or they became cynical and modernist. But there are ghosts that are there in literature, and those ghosts reappear and they start shedding a new light on the circumstance that surrounds them. And let's see, and I would prefer the word romanticism, and neo-romanticism I think is slightly reconsidered. I don't know, Professor Payal Nagpal will talk about it. It appears a bit negative, but I think in the case of this poet, there seems to be total appreciation of Keats and
Yes.
Wordsworth that you mentioned, Professor Payal Nagpal. And please tell us as to how this is romantic, and how in the 20th and 21st centuries one goes back to the 19th century for asserting humanism, for asserting the body, for finding an answer in imagination. All these implications might be there, and whether she is totally for it or, well, with some kind of a correction, all these things will should haunt us in our discussion. So let's see how you respond to it.
Yes, I think I completely agree with you that when we use the term neo-romantic at times, it carries a different connotation. But in this case, actually, so it's not as if she's only it's not as if she's just talking about the themes that were picked up by the romantic writers. So she is picking up themes that are relevant to her, and we'll see that when we discuss the poem What Were They Like. But I would like to draw attention again to this particular statement of hers in an interview, where she says, my early, and she really likes to use the brackets and the parenthesis. So she says, and abiding, my early, and in brackets, and abiding, love of Keats and Wordsworth is inseparable from my early, again in brackets, and equally abiding love for the English countryside. So in the context of Keats, she says that the sensuous music of his poetry, and which is something that she says she enjoyed in the context of Tennyson also. And then, of course, the letters. And in his attitude to poetry, she says, in the case of Wordsworth, I have great music too. But as you well know, Wordsworth walks and Keats dances. So, I think it is this ability to walk and to dance that she combines. And of course, not to forget Coleridge, and the way in which this idea of imagination is something that she is using, by bringing in, for instance, what we discussed in the poem about marriage, about the fantastic, as she sees it in these numerous short lines in the brackets. So she says, I love the details of nature in Wordsworth and the evocation of rich solitude and much else. Having said this, it's not as if Levertov does not pick up the themes that are relevant to her age, and she goes back to what was relevant to the romantics. So in this sense, I would say that she partakes in terms of sensibility from the romantics, because a kind of directness in her writing, which is not really to be seen in that time with the heavy influence of the modernist writers. I think what she really speaking manages is a kind of, as Professor Prakash pointed out in the previous lecture, a kind of conversational tone, and ensuring that the reader, somewhere I think she does have the reader in mind, ensuring that she taps the reader's imagination, and yet all of what she's saying is totally infused with the kind of humanism that she believes in and that she inherits, from the romantics, where there is an organic connection between the individual and the environment. So, and at the same time, she is also very critical. So, if we look at this particular poem, which is titled What Were They Like, and who does she refer to by using the pronoun they? Who is they really speaking in the title? They is the Vietnamese people, and she is writing about them in the context of the war. So she says, Did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? So she's just trying to visualize, before the war, what was the culture really like? Who were these people? What were their rituals? What was their life all about? So she asks, did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? Had they an epic poem? Did they distinguish between speech and singing? Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. It is not remembered whether in gardens, stone gardens, illumined pleasant ways. Perhaps they gathered once to delight in blossom. So, how would they get together? How would they celebrate? One doesn't know. So she says, perhaps they gathered once to delight in blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. So look at this shift in tone. I mean, of course, Levertov does it with great ease, but the transition is made. And here, so moving from, speech and singing, whether they had a literature of their own, the epic poem, the use of jade, silver, bone, ivory for ornament. So, and suddenly the entire picture is, it's not just dark, it's very, very dark. After their children were killed, there were no more buds. Sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. These lines are direct. It's not as if Levertov is alluding to, like the modernist train, she's not bringing in references to other texts or referring to other concepts, but she's speaking directly. And she's speaking from a very, very humane position, asserting that the humanity is what is needed. And she's drawing attention to, in a sense, the oppressed group. So she says, her laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. A dream ago, perhaps. Ornament is for joy. All the bones were charred. So here, the bones, the reference to bones here, the bones that are charred, and the reference to jewelry there in the beginning, these are two very different ideas. Here I would request Professor Prakash to comment on this particular poem, which is very, very different in a sense from the poems that we discussed in the previous lecture.
In fact, already you have answered that question which was raised regarding romanticism. It may be romanticism of a sort that is at the center of one's heart, but then one looks out and sees that there is a kind of Vietnamese war going on and people reject it, and Vietnamese people suffer a lot from the violence in the war, and that the poet is deeply concerned about it. So I think it's a very highly political poetry, and particularly, it might have created controversies in the 1950s and 60s when the war was hot.
Yes.
And I think she was very courageous to, talk about pro-Vietnamese emotion that is inherent in her poetry so very well. And being an American and then talking about the war and in critical terms is remarkable.
Is an act of courage. And this is where I think, one wonders, why is it that writers like Levertov probably are not really speaking red, in discuss the way they really speaking should be. So, and then this poem is a longer one compared to the ones we discussed earlier. So she says, all the bones were charred. It is not remembered. Remember, most were peasants. Their life was in rice and bamboo. When peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces, maybe fathers told their sons old tales. So as you can see, a very peaceful atmosphere has been built up about peaceful clouds, a water buffalo, father telling their sons old tales, and then the tone becomes dark once again. So she writes, maybe fathers told their sons old tales. When bombs smashed those mirrors, there was time only to scream. So there is an echo yet of their speech which was like a song. So, whether they had songs, whether it was speech. So she says, there is an echo yet of their speech which was like a song. It was reported their singing resembled the flight of moths in moonlight. who can say it is silent now? Because they are dead, so one can't hear anything. And this makes us go back in a sense to the first couple of lines. Did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver, and so on? Did they have an epic poem? So these are people who don't exist. And there is this constant shift in tone from one that creates a very blissful, peaceful atmosphere, talking about illumination, talking about the peasants and peaceful clouds, and suddenly, imagining what it would have been like for them to have faced what they did and to understand that now there is no sound. So it is a thought like this that is weaved so well into this particular poem, and as I said, it's written in a very, very different tone as compared to the other poems.
And as you discuss, there seems to be a kind of connection between the two opposites, the opposite of emotion and psychology, or the mind, imagination, that comes from romanticism, and the realism that comes from the war situation. And she was not there when the First World War occurred, and she wouldn't have been. She was born in 1923. But the horrors of war were still in the imagination of people in the 1920s when she was growing up as a child, and suddenly in a couple of decades or even less, the war started again, and this time it was much more horrifying. And being a sensitive person and a person who is not given to that kind of rationality which is there in academicism, she was face to face with destruction in the Second World War. And then she saw, a kind of attack on women, children, people who were innocent, who were not directly involved in the war, and they had no role to play, and yet, they suffered. So this kind of humanism, I think, is also deeply, ingrained in romanticism of the 19th century.
Yes.
Because there is some connection of war in the form of 1789 when the French Revolution occurs, and that gives kind of birth to what can be called romanticism. So that connection is there.
Yes, in fact, these lines, remember, most were peasants and their life was in rice and bamboo. The recognition that the people who suffer the most in the context of war are the common people. They are the ones who are wiped out. It's not anybody else, but it's the common people.
And they were the heroes of romantic imagination.
They were the heroes of the romantic imagination.
Yes.
So
the peasantry is there.
Yes.
To give that kind of thing. So she's I think looking forward. The romantic, some of the discussion of romanticism is that looks backward, but that's not the case.
No.
But she's looking from romanticism at the present scene when there is so much of violence.
I would say that the sensibility is romantic more than kind of going back to
Very
that
positive,
period. Very
yes.
Positive, very, very looking at human beings in their very organic connection with nature, looking at humanism as the only answer to all sorts of problems, and to say that when bombs smashed those mirrors, there was time only to scream. So she's trying to visualize what the people would have felt and what happened to them. So I think in a sense this her poems on Vietnam are important because they also kind of document that moment from the point of view of the Vietnamese people. So in fact here I would also like to share a quotation here. So who can say is for example a rhetorical flourish that indicates the war machine's lack of interest and the poet's inability to articulate that voice. The silence marks a boundary of comprehension, of engagement, of the authentic utterance. And this is from an excerpt from an article by Subarno Chatterjee. So the Vietnamese in the poem are mute witnesses and sufferers with no agency to influence their lives. And so Chatterjee says that this is the position of malleability, that's desired, by the Americans who wish to mold the Vietnamese in the likeness of Western models of democracy and capitalism. So, but what we have here is, in that sense, a moment that is documented by a woman poet, Denise Levertov, who wants to capture what has really happened to human civilization in the context of the Vietnam War. It's not, and she's specific about it. She's naming it. She's not keeping it general or hiding behind words. She's putting it forward. So I think it is really an act of courage to.
And I think she can be easily, equated with, the concern that Miller showed, that Sartre showed, that
Yes.
Bertrand Russell showed.
Yes.
Those people, they were deeply involved in, and Graham Greene for that matter, of course,
Yes.
a religious person otherwise. But then the kind of things that he discussed, you had a lecture on Graham Greene once, I remember.
Yes.
And so Vietnam is that important. And more than Vietnam, it is the suffering of humanity, and particularly in the village. Now, what has village to do with the modern world, except that it sustains it? And when that person is in danger, that style is in danger, then a genuine poet like Levertov would be pained, and that pain or ache is there. And I think the movement seems to be from the personal, as you said, which was political, to the apparently and externally personal, political, which is the Vietnam War.
She was greatly, distressed by the Vietnam War, and she was greatly influenced also by the protest movements of the 60s, and there are several poems on that too. So, if you were to look at a little bit of what some critics have to say about, her idea of poetry. So, Laurie Smith, for instance, says that Levertov sustains a devotion to the formalist creed that poetry is a way of constructing. This is actually, Smith is quoting Levertov here. Poetry is a way of constructing autonomous existences out of words and silences. And I think we can see how, she's making use of silence in the end of this particular poem. Who were these people really speaking? Her late romantic poetics amalgamates Keats' imagination and negative capability, Emerson's and Williams's mediation between the spirit of here and now and the supernatural realm of values, is what Smith really speaking says about this. So, and how, because every writer who writes through the decades will also have shifting themes. So, from the personal to the protest movements, to the Vietnam War, and of course to themes that were religious. So, Smith marks this particular transition and says, but the Vietnam War and the social turmoil of the 60s compel Levertov and many of her contemporaries to align themselves with younger radicals, question their aesthetic assumptions, and address political issues directly in poems and public readings. The trauma of the war violently disrupts Levertov's unifying vision and psychic integrity. So she quotes one of the lines from a poem, reduced to an I forget what I was. So
I think it's a very fine example of war poetry.
Yes.
Even though people have not discussed her as a war poet, and you say they have not discussed her at all, so that shows that her voice was the voice that raised eyebrows, and therefore people would rather play safe than discuss her poetry.
Yes, which is why I think that if there is one part of her writing which completely resonates with the Romantics, there is a part of her writing which is on the war, and she is referred to at times as a war poet. So we see how in Denise Levertov's poems on protest and war, her sensibility continues to have a connection with the Romantics, and this combination of directness, of imagination, all these things come together. And primarily, I think in this particular context would be a kind of direct address, because as mentioned earlier, that writers were greatly influenced by a kind of creating a kind of jargon in which there would be a kind of complexity, a linguistic complexity, and ideas would be weaved into words, into a linguistic complexity, whereas Denise Levertov is looking at certain kinds of autonomous existence of words and images, as she puts forward. And of course, to agree with Smith, that with war poetry, more so a kind of directness that one sees in her writing. And again, to quote Denise Levertov herself, she says, and this is very important, and I quote what she says in an interview, the only responsibility peculiar to the poet is to poetry, language, art, the aesthetic conscience. Historical moments elicit response, more in some individuals than in others. If that individual is a poet, that response may take the form of poetry, but that is an opportunity, not an obligation. And she says that, poets share the same obligations as others, no more, no less. A poet can be historian, witness participant, but that is always an individual response. So she says, she gives a beautiful example here and says, Walt Whitman wrote about the Civil War, Emily Dickinson did not. So I think, this really kind of tells us, and when asked about, the moment of the 80s and 90s and so on, and the road ahead, she felt that, non-violent action of all human beings is what is needed. And she was very bold in her interview to say that this is obviously not a realistic hope. So what she hopes for is a non-violent action of all human beings, and recognizes that this hope that she has is probably not realistic. She says at the present state of human evolution. And she says that if we don't destroy the planet first, we can then hope for further evolution, which she calls a kind of spiritual evolution. So I think it is a realistic recognition of the time to which she belongs and what she has witnessed, and to translate that into poetry is something that Denise Levertov has done beautifully. And I think we need to kind of engage more with Levertov's poetry than one really speaking has.
No, I agree with you. And so the other thing is, that there is a kind of commonness between the romantic melancholy, the romantic sense of pain, the romantic sense of alienation and,
Yes.
loneliness. And modernist poets would sometimes be very, they would have a kind of levity, patient is raised on a table and all those things.
Yes.
And laughing at things, or at least, drawing some kind of an applause from on the basis of words. Now, she is not doing that. She has, I think you quoted in the previous part, Wordsworth's phrase, still sad music of humanity. So she's talking about the sad music of humanity. And Keats, and all these other writers, they are very seriously engaging with the situation, and that's what the crux of romanticism is.
Yes.
And that she is retained, and she has evolved, in her own way. So I not see, you have quoted many of her lines, and I don't see any levity and any light-heartedness and any kind of humor in it. No. It's all very serious, and sensitive.
Yes. I mean, to actually say this, that, this is not a realistic hope, and, if we don't destroy the planet first, today we're talking about climate concerns and so on. I think back in the 80s and 90s, when she says these lines, it's a recognition of the fact that we are headed in the wrong direction.
Yes, definitely.
And I think this particular statement made by Levertov raises the question of what, really speaking, evolution means. How do human beings evolve, and what is the kind of evolution? Evolution should always mean to evolve into something better. And she's raising the question that, are we really doing that? So,
and see the humanists of today, Stephen Hawking,
Yes.
he died the other day, and he said there doesn't seem to be any hope. And therefore, what he said was a kind of a wish, that some human beings have to be transported to other planets so that humanity survives. So that kind of fear is there in the 20th century, and she is so very empathetic to that particular view. That humanity, evolution, all these things have to be retained in such a manner that the war situation, the destruction, the violence is just discarded, and the idea of peace and tranquility. And then that should be evolved
absolutely.
further.
In fact, it's not always very, what should one say, because there's a wide range in her poetry. It's not always very green and bright. So, for instance, she describes the protesters very interestingly. So, there is a poem that's titled At the Justice Department, November 15th, 1969. And she sees them as brown gas fog, white beneath the street lamps, bodies that stumble in brown airlessness, and so on. And how one hand is holding the other hand and trying to kind of get the protesters to support each other. So that really it's again a long poem, that so where she says that up that bank where gas curled in the ivy, dragging each other up, strangers, brothers and sisters, nothing will do but to taste the bitter taste, no life other apart from. So, you know, and she was very, I think just this, the image that she sees of the way in which, despite all odds, the protesters are holding their hands and are, you know, kind of encouraging each other. So I think that is, despite a very, very dismal beginning, I think there's always, like you said, hope and positivity, and wish for a better future and wish for a better planet.
So friends, we come to the end of the discussion, and the points that have been made regarding this poet, very important 20th century poet, they refer to, you know, marriage and institution of oppression and all those things that denies, you know, equality to women, and from there on to the romanticism that she is able to take from the 19th century itself, and using it in her context, which is both social and political, and finally, you know, she hates destruction, and she wants that this should completely be done away with, and that human beings should try to and love to in fact live together peacefully and with that kind of, you know, tranquil you know, comfort that people have. So I think it's a good example of a poet in the 20th century who gives us hope, who also is very realistic in the sense, you know, that she wants to retain humanity in its best form. And this kind of poetry should be in fact discussed more and more, and in fact popularized among the masses, you know, who suffer as much as the earlier masses who lost their lives in the two wars that happened in the 20th century. So we come to the conclusion that finally Professor Payal Nagpal is able to stress the basic point of Levertov's poetry, and that point is that human beings have to sustain themselves, have to preserve themselves, and have to live happily together as equals. So I think that's the kind of lesson that you conveyed. So thanks, Professor Payal Nagpal, and viewers, you must also consider these points, you know, in your own mind with, you know, that kind of empathy which is there in this poet. Thank you.